to talk about what in the world is God doing. The world is an interesting place. Our community is an interesting place. It kind of reflects a lot of the parts of the world, but not in their own parts, if you kind of just put it together and made a casserole. I really enjoy maps. I don't know about you, I've always enjoyed looking at Jonathan's illustration this morning about pulling out the atlas on a road trip. I used to sit in the back seat with one of those and kind of just trace out along with us whatever we saw. Maps don't just tell us where things are, though. That's what people think a map is. A map is a way of conceptualizing the world, conceptualizing information. So you can have many different kinds of maps. So here's one. It's obviously not drawn to scale. My Latin's a bit rusty, but I think it says, if you're reading this, get a life. So what is the map above? What does this tell you?
We're all beautiful like a flower.
This is a theological map of the world. Right? You see, it's very Trinitarian. It's kind of a metaphor in that regard, yes. So this map conceptualizes the world in theological terms. Jerusalem is the center. The Messiah is the center, and so then you have this Trinitarian portrayal of Europe, Asia, Africa. In a very real sense, Israel is the crossroads of these three continents, historically speaking, which is what's made it such a contested bit of land. A friend of mine told me the saying. He said, Christianity started in the Middle East as a relationship. It moved to Greece, where it became a philosophy. It went to Rome, where it became a system, and it moved to America, where it became a business. Think about that for a moment. Middle East as a relationship, Greece, philosophy, Rome, system, America, business. Now, the church has gone, I love this, but it's a little bit too simplistic because the church has gone so many places. But wherever you grow up, you probably have this assumption, well, how I experience church and how I understand church is the way to understand church. And so this class is really going to challenge that idea, particularly for those of us in the West, because for a long time, the West has kind of been the center of Christianity, so to speak, in terms of schools, in terms of population, in terms of books published, in all of these different ways. And so some people think that the way that we are now doing it is the way that it has always been done and is the way it has been done in all places and all times. And so we're going to make you uncomfortable a little bit if that's your view. So where is the center of Christianity? It started in Israel, right? The early church, Pentecost. You had people from all different countries right there, gathered together. Pentecost sent them, spread them out throughout the world. Very quickly you have the Ethiopian eunuch who's there, who becomes a believer, goes back to Ethiopia. You have Saul, who later becomes Paul. Where does he go first? Damascus, Syria, right? So we always just think, well, the church was in Israel and then somehow, boom, Europe and America, and that's Christianity. The church fathers were all these Greek-speaking fathers. One of my favorite authors, Kenneth Bailey, he does a lot of New Testament cultural studies, and he has spent, I think, about 3 careers in the Middle East, and so he's translating the Arab church fathers. So if you go to seminary, you learn Greek. And so if you learn Greek and decide, well, I want to read some church fathers, you only are going to read the Greek-speaking church fathers, which means for about 2,000 years now, most of the people who've grown up in our seminaries have not even scratched the surface, haven't even opened the cover of what about the early Christians in the Arab world. And so he does some of that. It's very interesting stuff. One writer notes there's 2 trends. One is the de-Christianization of the Western world. I don't have to tell anybody how Europe has gone postmodern and post-Christian. I don't have to tell you that we're about 50 years behind where they are. Church after church after church in Europe is shutting down, and the space is being sold for offices, for fancy coffee shops and bars. And in the Northeast, my sister lived in Massachusetts for several years, and we're driving through the countryside, started noticing a bunch of these pristine churches. I mean, just very, very, very quaint churches that had been not closed down, but had been bought out by Wiccans. If you go to a city like Detroit, you can see where Christians moved out of the city, and so the church goes vacant. And then you can see where Muslims moved into the area, so it's a church building with a crescent on top, but now the building is lying completely empty because they too have moved out of the area. And so there's no need to convince you of this first point, but the second that surprises a lot of people is the Christianization of the world. When we talk about missions, we always talk about the unreached, unengaged. And I think this is important, but you kind of get the idea, if you only talk that language, that, well, there's not Christians elsewhere. And there are. So this map right here has depicted this shift. So some of the numbers are kind of small. So you see Jerusalem, that has the year AD 33. And so it kind of tracks the population center. So in the 1970s is over there in Morocco, Western Sahara. So that's the furthest west that it's been. Morocco was not actually the center in terms of Moroccan people, okay? It was the fact that this map is accounting for people in the United States, Latin America. But it's made a slow climb up into Europe through the early Middle Ages, and then it shifted west as a lot of the population of the world shifted west. But now the latest phenomena is that the church is shifting, the center of the church, the major population of the church is shifting south and back to the east. So as Christian America, I use air quotes on purpose, as Christian America is becoming post-Christian, as Christian Europe is becoming post-Christian, it is Africa and it is Latin America and it is Asia now where the population base for Christians is growing. So in 1900, 83% of Christians lived in North America and Europe. 83% of the world's Christians lived there. Today, 60% of all Christians live in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So just in a short time period, a little over 100 years, that population has shifted from the majority in the West to now the majority is in the rest. One person says, Christianity is the religion of over 2,000 different language groups in the world. More people pray and worship in more languages in Christianity than in any other religion in the world. One of the documents that I'll post into the channel is this one. It's by the Pew Foundation, and they talk about the spread of global Christianity, and then they have all these really interesting highlights. I'll share the highlights of their highlights with you here. There are 5 networks of underground churches in China. Each of these networks is larger than the largest denomination in the U.S. Now we're talking about one network of churches in one country is larger than the largest denomination in the United States. 1,500 years of church history took place in Asia before Western missionaries ever arrived. Now, Western missionaries have done huge things in China, in Asia, but there were Christians there before they got there. Now, we have some presenters who are going to share about the situation in China, so I don't want to take from them. But people are often amazed that there's so much church history in a place that we have perceived for so long to be completely unchristian or non-Christian. Africa, they've had nearly 2,000 years of continuous Christian history. Think about that. I mean, almost an unbroken succession. So outside of Israel, Ethiopia was one of the earliest Christian countries. And there's still Christians there today. So they have an unbroken line of Christian history. In 1900, under colonialism, there were 8.7 million Christians in Africa. In 1962, free of colonialism, there were 60 million Christians in Africa. In the year 2000, there were 220 million Christians in Africa. So outside of colonial rule, now again, we're going to talk about colonialism today and the role of colonial missionaries, but outside of colonial rule, the church in Africa has exploded. Much of early church dialogue, many of the early church fathers were dialoguing in Latin. So the Latin-based, European church had come to Africa, but a lot of the early church fathers that are dialoguing are doing so from an African perspective. And so much of our early theology, we've kind of erased nationality, ethnicity, language off of it because it was all done in Latin, so we kind of assume, well, it's all sort of this Greco-Roman thing. But a lot of it's actually coming from African voices. And so many of the early church fathers were from Africa. In fact, the man who recognized the 66 books of the Bible that we as Protestants recognize as the Bible, so if you're Catholic, you have the Apocrypha and some other books, but the person who recognized these 66 was from North Africa. So the Bible that we have today is a result of an African, not in the sense that he created it, but as the books were being written, as false gospels were being written at the same time, the church was wading through. This is the process of canonization. That's a whole different class. But he was the first one, we would say, to get it right. Maps tell us so much. This is what British colonialism looked like, not necessarily at any one point in time, but if you look at all of the territories that they have possessed at some point or another at one moment, this is what it would look like. And so their spread was huge, huge. There's French empires. We don't think about, they call it the Francophone world, the French-speaking world, but that represents almost 500 million people. There's not 500 million people in France, but there's French speakers all over the world now because of their empire. The Dutch had a massive empire. So here's a map specifically of Africa that gives you the breakdown of how Africa was parceled out between European powers. And so you have things like Belgium, France, Germany, that red color is Great Britain, Italy, Portugal, Spain. That final color there is independent. I think the only one to claim that status is Ethiopia and Liberia. I'm not sure about Liberia. I am sure about Ethiopia, but you can see this map here. This was portrayed in British newspapers as the British Empire spread, right? There's this general here stretching 1 foot to the other from south to north across Africa. There was one point during the height of the colonial era that 3 men from Europe controlled 60% of the world's peoples, languages, governments, lands, etc. So colonial powers used to have a lot of influence. And lest we forget our own colonial past, we too were a colony. I love to remind my friends in Egypt of this when they would start talking about, empires coming from the outside, and I go, whoa, 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 that was not us. We too were colonized. We kicked them out. But we were kind of, America. We were parceled out, between a number of different European countries ourselves. One of our speakers who's going to share their testimony is French-Canadian, so that will be interesting to hear that perspective. So during this time, colonial missionaries went out. Colonial forces, political forces, opened up new mission fields, and these two things kind of happened in conjunction. They often went with the trade companies, sometimes in spite of the trade companies. They often petitioned their governments to do more from a Christian standpoint to allow missionaries greater access. A lot of the trade companies were kind of at odds with the missionaries because they perceived the missionaries' interests to be different from their own. And in this time, there's, just like that old Western, there's the good, the bad, the ugly. And some of the good things is that these missionaries obeyed God and returned the Western church to a missions focus, which had long since been absent. At this point, for several hundred years, had been absent from the Western church. And so they helped return the church to understanding God does have a mission for the church. They were willing to go to hard places and hard times. I mean, today, it's really difficult. You have to kind of be trying as an American to get into some serious trouble in another country. Not that it can't happen, but it was just a common assumption there that if you go to another country at that time that you're going to be in jail, that you're going to have no medical help, that there's going to be some new disease that you have no clue what the fix is, that you've never encountered before. It was just assumed. In fact, missionaries would actually oftentimes pack up their belongings in a coffin to take over with them. There was no furlough and coming back. Like, you went there to die. Oftentimes they would leave their children at home, or they would leave if they might have children there. There was one missionary who had children in 3 different countries because for whatever reason he had been forced to move. They buried children on the field. They buried wives on the field. One missionary went crazy, sat out in the jungle for 2 months in a grave that he dug for himself next to his wife's grave. Okay, modern mission agencies would never let this happen today. And I would say for good reason, for good reason. That's obviously not healthy. So for all of what I'm about to say about colonial missionaries, they did have the willingness to go and to stick it out and to endure hard things. The bad. Cultural imperialism. American missionaries, they were not just missionaries. They were also purveyors of culture. And I would say this still happens even to this day. A lot of times their gospel, even if they're not intending it to, is often infused with American attitudes, American ways of thinking, American ways of functionalism. And so sometimes the gospel doesn't come in just as this neutral nugget, this neutral deposit. It comes in wearing American clothes, speaking an American accent. And some of this is unavoidable. As the global church is now sending missionaries throughout, we can say the same thing of other missionaries, that it comes in wearing, Korean clothes or Nigerian clothes, or this is part of being human, is that we have cultures. There were a lot of unintended consequences that missionaries had. One of the unintended consequences in the Middle East, there's this little group called the Muslim Brotherhood, you've probably heard of. That was started by an educator. Now, what you know of the Muslim Brotherhood is probably that they're some sort of radical political organization / terrorists, and at times they were definitely a cantankerous bunch of people. However, they started as an education movement. They started as a counter-education movement because missionaries were going into North Africa and they were focusing on poor areas and they were starting schools for children. And so poor farmers were forced to choose between education or religion. And so the Muslim Brotherhood started. Hassan al-Banna was the founder of this. He was an educator in Egypt, and he started schools in poor areas. And so the movement continued to have a focus. But in India as well, Hinduism exists today as it does, as an ism, as clearly defined as it is, because of early Hindu thinkers' interaction with Western missionaries, where they were, because there was now a counter option, they are forced to more clearly define what is Hinduism. Rather than just this random smorgasbord of things that it means to be Indian, now they had to define theology. This is now actually kind of reintegrated all the way back here into the States. So we have close to 36 Hindu temples in Houston that now have denominational titles associated with them. So there are now denominations of Hindus that are also now even in our own city. Just like we have denominations that are, you go to Kenya or go to Nairobi and you'll see more denominations. I think they have more there than they do here in Houston. And so a lot of religious resurgence happened, native religious resurgence happened in response to children converting out of their parents' religion. The ugly. Some missionaries were involved in revolutions. They helped topple governments in some instances. Some were involved in the opium trade, right? The drug trade, just to be clear. So imagine if all of a sudden there were missionaries coming into your neighborhood that were somehow in cahoots with local drug dealers. You'd have a problem with it. And guess what? That government did and kicked them out. Again, somebody else is going to present on that. I don't want to go too deep there. That's a problem. Conversely, it might fund your mission trip. I don't know. There's a line in fundraising we shouldn't cross, and I feel like drug trade, cartelling is on the other side. Just to be clear. Put that on the table. Some of them were involved in genocide. You might have seen the movie Hotel Rwanda. Part of what the movie did not show is the influence of the Dutch church, which was only in Rwanda because they had colonized Rwanda. The Dutch church had spun this tale that, so you had two ethnic groups that this was involved with. You had the Hutu and you had the Tutsi. So one was the majority group, the other minority. And the church had told them the Tutsi are part of the line of Ham. So you have Noah and his sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. One of them walks in on his dad, and we're not entirely sure what it is, but he turns around and curses his son. And so the line that these people were told is kind of, it is your birthright to extinguish this evil line. The church has since come out and apologized for this, but again, genocide probably crosses a big line. So out of the colonial movement comes post-colonialism. This is where colonial powers went into particular areas, took over, ruled these places, instituted their will, oftentimes took their resources back with them. So there's more Egyptian artifacts in the UK than there are in Egypt, which is saying something because there are a ton of them in Egypt. But there's this resurgence of nationalism as colonial powers, one by one, slowly start backing away from their colonial holdings. So according to one count, there were about 92 acquisitions of Muslim territories by non-Muslim governments between, let's say, 1800 and 1900. Okay? 92 acquisitions of governments. By 1995, 69 of these territories were back under Muslim rule. And 45 of them also had overwhelming Muslim populations. So they might not be Muslim states per se, but they had a significant portion. So there's this mass expansion of European powers throughout the world, all the way to the Americas. And then there was this huge throwing off of the chains of colonialism that marks post-colonialism. And so there's tons of studies in post-colonialism, post-colonial theology, post-colonial philosophy, post-colonial politics and political theory. And so there's this massive reaction that happened there. And a lot of these new governments were very quick to not just kick out the foreign governments, but to also kick out the foreign missionaries, who, because they came in on the same boats and stood next to the people who had the guns, they were perceived to be one and the same. And whether this is right or wrong, that is the perception. And so they were given the boot as well because they were perceived to be a threat. Another part of post-colonialism is religious resurgence, the rise of Hinduism, the rise of Islam in these modern times, where it's not just a religious thing, but now it's taken on a much more forceful political side in terms of trying to eradicate other religious beliefs in the country. Theology that was wrapped in Western clothing created a vacuum when it pulled out. Even in Western countries, there's a vacuum here, right? As we have moved into post-Christendom in America and Europe, we haven't become less spiritual. People are still seeking spiritual answers, right? That's what the spring class was about. People are looking to New Age movement, and I'm not religious, I'm spiritual, and all of these different ways, they're filling this void. So inadvertently, all of these people, all of these missionaries, whether they wanted to or not, they mobilized nationalism, they mobilized a religious resurgence. So if you look at, in the Middle East, if you look at pictures of people in Egypt in the 60s and 70s, it looks strange. None of the women have their head covered. You go on the street in Egypt today, every person, unless they're a foreigner or a Christian, has their head covered. What changed? Well, from the 70s, they got their first Egyptian president that they had had in several hundred years. Prior to that, they'd had British influence, French influence, and so now they finally have someone that is their own leader. And so there's this religious resurgence. This happens in any time of exile. The Jews go into exile, and they go, why did God send us into exile? Oh, we worshipped other gods, and we sacrificed our children to Molech, and we did this and we did that. Let's stop doing all of this. Let's start following the law again. And so a religious resurgence came out of the exile called the Pharisees, who are known for their extreme dedication to the minutia of the law and to adding a hedge around the law to make sure they don't even get close to breaking the law. And so this religious resurgence has come throughout the world as people have tried to re-identify their own national and ethnic and religious identity and to try to reimagine it without colonial powers, without Western power influence. And so this is a very political backlash. And this has implications in the church. So under colonialism, the colonial powers came in and kind of metaphorically they say, hey, we have the powers, we make the rules. So the church looks like us, right? We're going to translate hymns into tribal languages, and we're going to bring in stained glass, and we're going to send your pastors to our seminaries, and we're going to make you play organ music, and all of these things. We have the power, we make the rules, we set the agenda. Post-colonialism is the reversal of this. We're the national church. You outsiders, y'all don't tell us what to do. Now, we have the power, so we're going to make the rules. Neither of these is healthy, right? Because being part of the body of Christ, we are part of a different spiritual reality than our own ethnic identity, than our own political identity. And so it's not healthy for me to look at the Nigerian church, the Kenyan church, the Latin American church and say, I have no need of you. That's not a biblical attitude. But it's neither biblical for them to look at the American church and say, I have no need of you. So there's a lot of missionaries now talking about what does a brotherhood era look like, where neither of us, it's not about power. It's about we're fellowshipping, walking together as brothers and sisters, and Jesus sets the agenda. So let's think more theologically about this now. We have a global God. If you look at the Abrahamic covenant, we go, okay, God called Abraham, great, he's going to be the father of nations. There's Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the rest of Old Testament history. And we kind of truncate it like that. But God gives Abraham a promise, and in the promise he says, leave your country, leave your father, leave your home, and he's going to make you, he said, I'm going to make you a father of nations, and I'm going to bless you. I will bless you to be a blessing. How is he going to bless him? You're going to take a road trip. You're going to leave and go somewhere else. And he says, all the peoples of the earth will be blessed. He got him started in this being a blessing road trip, in this journey, by sending him away. And he sent them to a foreign land. There's a passage in Genesis, and it mentions Canaanites, Kenites, Kenizzites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaites, Amorites, Girgashites, and Jebusites, 10 nations. In addition to these 10, there's about 30 other entire peoples that are spread from Egypt and across Mesopotamia, so modern-day Iraq, Saudi Arabia, etc., that are mentioned in Genesis. In fact, there's probably more nations mentioned in that short passage of Genesis than anywhere else in the Bible. And we don't let this sink in to think, there's lots of political movements, and we'll get into this in some of the later talks. There's lots of political movements now trying to identify the ethnicity of Jesus, or to rescue the ethnicity of Jesus from people who have identified him incorrectly. And this completely overlooks how global just the very first couple pages of the Bible are. It's not about white or black or this or that. It seems that God is speaking, he's a global God. He is speaking of himself in regards to all of the nations. The next thing we see is the Jerusalem Council. Obviously, I've jumped a huge portion, but Acts 15, there's this whole push into the Gentile world. So now you have good Jewish missionaries that are going out into pagan Gentile areas, and there's now a cultural clash. People are showing up at church picnics with ham sandwiches. What are we going to do about it? Right? They invited us to a pig picking. What do we do? And so we know from Paul and other New Testament writers that salvation is apart from the law. And yes, this is a statement about law keeping. This is a statement about salvation. What we fail to see is this is also a statement about culture. You and I are saved apart from the law. It means we can't earn it. We can't work for it. We can't deserve it. Yes. It also means we don't have to be Jewish. We don't have to first graft into the Jewish tribe and adopt all Jewish practices and fit a Jewish model for being acceptable. In order for Christ's salvation to be applied to us, we are saved apart from any works. We are saved apart from the law. And so we see early on in the Jerusalem Council, they had to come to a resolution of, clearly for us, we are the Jewish people, and so we have to follow a certain cultural pattern, but they understood this pattern is not valid for every culture. Our answers don't answer everybody's questions. People in the Greek world have different questions. I lead people on trips around the city, and we go visit different temples. One of them right here is the Taochu Temple. For many people, the question on meat sacrifice to idols is a theoretical question, because for us, we don't really live in that world. You go there and you see people paying homage in various ways to these statues, walking distance from our church. And all of a sudden, we rescue this passage out from theory, and it becomes practical. And so for the Jews, they lived in a certain context where their questions weren't the same as the Gentile questions. And they recognized this, and they said, we have to come to an agreement. And so the Jerusalem Council, they come to an agreement, and they send word back. So from the beginning days of creation, God is global. From the beginning days of church, God is global. Revelation 5:9, let's fast forward all the way to the end. This is the scene around the throne. It says, worthy are you, speaking to Jesus, to take the scroll and to open its seals. For you were slain, and by your blood you ransomed people for God from every tribe and language and people and nation. From every family group, from every ethnic group, from every language group, from every clan group, from every political group. So we ask ourselves the question, well, isn't theology universal? Doesn't the Bible just say what it says? One person says, when you talk about our theology, you say Latin American theology. When you talk about yours, you just say theology. And that's kind of how people approach this. Well, let's learn about Asian theology. Let's learn about African theology, Latin American theology, and then we'll just do a class on theology here at some point. And there's this sense in which our theology is theology with a capital T, and theirs is some kind of hyphenated lowercase theology. Well, ours is North American or Western theology, which has its own unique characteristics, but because we very rarely interact outside of that, beyond just maybe at a denominational level, we don't understand that ours is equally local. Another author says, what has typically been regarded as theology for the whole global church has been, in many respects, Western theology, which has been assumed to be universal theology. Many authors question the premise that the theological heritage that they receive from the West is somehow neutral and universal. They recognize that Western theology has a Western accent despite of its claims to the contrary. So some people think Western theology is this neutral box. It is the sort of the benchmark, if you will, that we're going to measure everything else off of, without understanding that it fits a certain cultural pattern in the same way that we might look at someone else's theology as being regional, and we see those distinctions. We can't see it ourselves because it's our own blind spot. So Western theology very largely is in response to Catholicism. This is speaking more modern times than historic, but for modern, say, Protestant theology, most of it is talking about answering Catholicism and trying to explain why we are not Catholic. So we talk about ecclesiology, our doctrine of the church. We talk about soteriology, our doctrine of salvation. We talk about our doctrine of sin. All of this is in response to why we are not Catholic. And I think at a certain point in our history, this was a very valid discussion. In a time and place in Europe where the Catholic Church had political authority to depose kings and to enforce its will on a people, this is a very valid argument that you have to theologize about. We live in a modern, pluralistic society in our world that the questions are very different. Not why not Catholicism, why not every other ism? And so I'm actually going to do, one of our nights is going to be on Christianity in light of world religions, trying to show how is our theology different from other religions' theology. Because these are the kind of things in a community like this right here, we have to wade through. We have the doctrine of the Holy Spirit, that God indwells us. How is this any different than Oprah Winfrey's, that the divine is within all of us? Is it different? Please say yes. Okay, thank you. So we need to get outside of this, we're only not Catholic, to think, in what ways are we also not everything else? Because our world, through globalization, through people living here, through the internet, through other religious groups coming, our world is just this jumbled, mixed-up mess where everybody lives side by side now. And so you really have to understand who you are and why. Second, Western theology is shaped by Enlightenment thinking. And so what I mean by that is we adopt very secular categories. We would apply theological answers to theological questions, but when someone's sick, typically people think, well, you should go to the doctor. We look for the scientific answer. Enlightenment thinking is very rationalistic. It's very scientific. It's very linear. It's abstract and philosophical. And so I'm not saying that any of this is right or wrong. I'm just saying it is what it is. An apple is an apple, and this is our apple. Okay? I am very rationalistic in how I approach things. I tend to be very linear. I tend to be abstract and philosophical. So I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just saying that is Western theology. That is not at all how Jesus reasoned about things. Right? Jesus reasons like a first century Hebrew. And so his thinking is much more narrative, much more example-driven, much more lifestyle-driven than how I want to teach theology. Again, not saying that one model is right or wrong. We see both models in Scripture. We see where Paul is more philosophical and abstract, and we see Jesus not being so much. But Western theology is kind of typified by these attributes, and sometimes we don't understand that not everyone is wired that way. This is a huge challenge for us when we go down to Peru and do pastor training, because they ask me a question and I immediately want to go, all right, here's my linear thought process. Here's the problem. Here's the next 3 steps. Therefore, here's the conclusion. Aha. You're welcome. And if I do that, everybody's just going to be staring there going, what? That doesn't make any sense at all. They're operating from a different rational standpoint. We have the global gospel. The sermons in Acts reflect unique context. Look at Acts 2. Look at Acts 17. Very different context, very different sermons. And so we see the early apostles, as they go and share in different places, their message has to start taking on the look and feel of the local context. We see that the Gospels reflect the unique local context. The concerns that John has and the concerns that Luke has are very different. I mean, Luke tells us which way the winds are blowing in certain passages. Luke tells us who's sitting in which political position of authority in some passages. John, his chronology is like he's just in one big circle. He doesn't seem to care about the chronology of Jesus' life at all. His concerns are much more theological, which is why you have all the great I am statements that he makes, all these big truth statements, is because he's not as concerned about what is, the first day of his life and then the next day, and what is his lineage and how do all these things play out. It's more, here is what the theological and the religious implications of Jesus being God in the flesh mean for us. So I think that theology from a global perspective, it's like a kaleidoscope. So our goal then is not to try to root everything out, is to try to understand how do we put these various perspectives together and look at through that lens. It's like a diamond. It has different facets. So we sometimes think that our facet is the only facet on the diamond, but there's multiple facets. And each of these facets brings out light. It reflects light. And so I would say every culture probably has parts of it that lend it to certain errors. And we're going to talk about different regional errors. But other cultures, every culture also has parts where it really reflects and exposes something that I might not understand from my own cultural background. I probably understand freedom in Christ better than someone who's not actually free. They probably understand submission to God as a sovereign way better than I do, just based on our political system. Because if we don't like the president, we can talk smack about him. We can, vote in a new one in a couple of years. So it's a very different mindset. It's a very different world. And so it's not that one way is right and the other is wrong. It's that both of us together, in communication together, we're helping bring out things about the Scriptures that are already there. And so the way forward is not non-Western theology or anti-Western theology, but more than Western. We do live in the West. This is our context, but particularly at our church, we have to think of more than Western things, more than North American things. The dialogue between times and cultures is the condition of a creative understanding, where creative does not mean innovation, like we're making this up. So this class is not to, hey, you're from this other country, come sit up here and make up some theology. That's not what we want to do. It's rather that we're looking for new insight. And that would be to say that the text or Christian history or whatever has new meaning that was already there that just me and my Western eyes couldn't see. And so we're trying to expose what is there, not just invent something new. So I think here's some things that I want us to affirm as we go through this class. One, all cultures and languages are fractured by the fall and are imperfect. If you're sitting in here and think that your culture has no imperfections, you probably don't have a very good understanding of your own culture, including American culture. And if that's how you approach things, you're going to have this very, like, I'm up here and all these other poor people are down here. This is really kind of the colonial model. Conversely, though, all cultures and languages experience God's common grace. All people in the world experience God's common grace. And so this is where we should have some optimism of, perhaps from a different cultural standpoint, we might learn what is already in Scripture that we just can't see because of our blind spots. The second thing is the Bible is read and interpreted by fallen human interpreters who read it through cultural lenses, right? That's you and I. So even my own interpretation of Scripture, even my own understanding of hermeneutics, is subject to the fall and the effects of the fall. However, there's a flip side of this. The Holy Spirit can direct interpretation and use cultural and linguistic elements to bring out truth that is there in spite of our fallenness. And so all of this should give us optimism. So I want to close with kind of a case study for you. The man's name is Said Qutb. He was also part of the Muslim Brotherhood. I would say he is the voice of the Muslim Brotherhood. He was in the 40s. In 48 to 1950, he came here to the United States. He was martyred by, oh my gosh, his name, Nasser, President Nasser, finally killed him for his political rivalries. I say he's the voice of the Muslim Brotherhood because during this time period, he's written a commentary on the entire Quran that pretty much anybody at least in Egypt, but they have pretty good influence outside of that, that they are referencing his commentary. But when he traveled to the United States from 1948 to 1950, he went to church every Sunday. Now imagine church in the States in the 50s, okay? I mean, we're talking Mayberry. We're talking, piano and organ music. We're talking people showing up, everybody showing up in, long skirts, hats, gloves, men in suits. We're talking about a very different time and place. Listen to what he says. So this is someone quoting from me. It says, he observed that there were many churches, but warned his readers that the numbers should not be misunderstood as expression of real religious or spiritual zeal. Churches in America, he said, operate like businesses, competing for clients and publicly, and for publicity, and using the same method as stores and theaters to attract customers and audiences. For the minister of a church, as for the manager of a business or a theater, success is what matters, and success is measured by size, bigness, numbers. To attract clientele, churches advertise shamelessly and offer what Americans seek most, a good time or fun. He's writing this in an Arabic newspaper, and he puts fun in English in the newspaper. So he doesn't even transliterate it or translate it to Arabic. The result is that the church recreation halls, with the blessing of the priesthood, hold dances. What? Where people of both genders meet, mix, and touch. Whew. The ministers even go so far as to dim the lights in order to facilitate the fury of the dance. The dance is inflamed by the notes of the gramophone. Gramophone. I don't even know what a gramophone.
It's a record player.
Is it? Okay. Thank you. Now I know. I learned something. He noted with evident disgust, the dance hall becomes a whirl of heels and thighs, arms enfold hips, lips and breasts meet. It feels a little exaggerative. And the air is full of lust.
What church is that?
Calm down. So this is a conservative Muslim man coming to the States, right, to Christian America, goes to church every Sunday. This is his church experience. What do people experience when they walk into Willcrest on a Sunday? Do they feel the same sense of, whoa, what is going on around here? Maybe they do, maybe they don't. So this is why this study of global theology matters. This is why having a posture of listening matters, is so that we can hear what are these expectations? How do people see these things? I've taken several I've taken many Christians on mosque tours. We had a group of imams who wanted to take a church tour. And these were educated guys. I mean, not poor farming imams. I mean, these were guys with degrees, and they were also engineers. I mean, smart guys. And they took a tour of a church, and in the Q&A, there's so many things they could have asked about. The question that kept coming back again and again and again is, how come y'all don't take your shoes off in your place of worship? And they just couldn't get over the fact that everybody's running around the church with their shoes on. So all of these cultural clashes, as we enter a city like Houston, a space like Wilcrest, all of these things matter. Okay, let's take a few moments for questions. Does anybody have any questions?
You're saying if someone walked into Wilcrest and see people touching, like shaking hands, and should we stop hugging?
Should we stop hugging because
During the invitation to meet each other.
Yeah, so we have a lady here who's from Algeria, North Africa, and that is her culture. At the same time, Wilcrest definitely has a very warm hugging culture, which doesn't just make internationals uncomfortable. Like, that makes even some Americans uncomfortable, depending on where you are on this spectrum, right? I'm seeing some nods. I'm not looking at anybody's faces, but I know. And I was in a conversation with her and a lady from Venezuela, and Venezuelans are very, very warm. And I know I can't say goodbye without hugging her, or she's going to think I'm mad. But if I hug her and not her, that'll be weird. But if I hug her, that'll be even weirder. I think I wait till someone kind of came up and interrupted, and I kind of slipped out and just dashed off. I would say it's definitely a challenge. And I think maybe there are some limits to how multi-ethnic we can be and be culturally appropriate, where I think maybe like warm cultures, Latino cultures, African cultures, and then kind of our Southern American culture here really mesh well. And that gets harder to cross when you get more into the Middle East or the Far East, where things are more reserved.
You're going to get some clashes.
Yeah, you're going to get some clashes. But I think it's something for us to think about. You know, we should at least kind of pause and think, what's the right way to greet this person? Maybe I will wait. Maybe I'll wait and see what they do, and then mimic that.
Yeah.
Any other questions? That's true. Let someone else make the faux pas.
Yeah.
Just let someone else make the faux pas. Go, hey, did you see the new visitors? And have somebody else go up and meet them, and then you can kind of judge. You're like, I'm sorry for that person. They just came. They do that. We're sorry.